I'm Shel Danielson. Today is December 6th, 2018.
And I'm Rob Hahn, and I'll ask the questions.
Great, Rob.
Let me start with some real basic and generic questions. Tell me, if you could, your first memory of going to Dinkytown.
I can't give you the first memory, but I can tell you what it was about, what drove me there, along with my friends. I was raised in a small Minnesota town. My parents moved to Edina, of all places, when I was 16. And Edina, for me, was really a place of isolation. It was a totally different culture from a small town. It was bland. It was all white. The only thing to do was to go to Southdale Mall. Dinkytown represented something else. It was a totally different culture. It was a chance to get outside of that box, of that suburbia blandness. And I think that's kind of what drove me there and a few of my friends. It was a chance to see something that was more interesting.
How did you hear about it? I mean, was there an article or a discussion? Was it in the news?
Well, some of my friends were artists. We were all interested in reading. We were interested in poetry. And through osmosis, maybe through an article, maybe through an art gallery opening, that's what it took. We were over there, and of course, once we saw the scene as it was then, we're 17 years old, and it was a way to get out of that suburban box.
What was the scene like when you first arrived?
Well, it had like a neighborhood feel to it, but there was more than just a neighborhood intersection of stores. It served the university. So it was a chance to see people from different cultures, people from different ethnic backgrounds. There were different foods. There were little mom and pop shops or individual proprietorships. You could see movies with the subtitles. You could get food from Japan, from Italy, from different places around the world. And then there were the people. And the people were all different. They dressed differently. There were people from Africa and from Asia, people you just didn't see in the town that I was living in. So it was pretty attractive and pretty interesting. There was a little bit of mystery about it, too.
What was the time frame when you were hanging out?
I'd say 58 to 60, 61 in there.
Let's go through some of the staples, locations there, and tell me your memories, if you would, specific or otherwise. There was the Scholar.
There was the Scholar. The Scholar is probably the place that's remembered by most people. It was really a magnet. It would not be unusual to be in the Scholar having a cup of coffee, maybe a cup of hot apple cider with a cinnamon stick in it. Somebody might be sitting up on that little stage playing acoustic guitar. There'd be a couple of bearded people over in the corner playing chess. A few other folks would be arguing radical politics. That's what I remember about the Scholar.
Vecchio's. Did you ever eat at Vecchio's?
Yes, but the big memory for me about Vecchio's was that they had music in the background, in the basement. And Coleman Hector, had a little band. He was a drummer and a bongo drum player. And he had a little trio that he worked with. And on weekends, he and his group would play in the basement, music room at Vecchio's.
I think you mentioned when we talked that there was pizza in Dinkytown, and that struck me as so odd, but maybe you can explain why it was so unique.
Sure. In the late 50s, pizza was kind of new. This is hard to believe for people, but it was kind of new, at least for me and my friends and the people that I knew. I can even remember having pizza-making parties. This was a big deal. But there was Valley Pizza and Vecchio's were there. And, they used real garlic and real sausage. And I don't think they had the frozen pizzas available then, not like they do today. It was almost an exotic food back then.
Another place that you mentioned during our phone conversation is McCosh's bookstore.
Yes.
Tell me both, if you would, about the bookstore and if you remember stories about the proprietor, Melvin, who was quite a character.
He was. And there were other bookstores in Dinkytown, too. And that was a big draw for people who loved to read. A typical bookstore would have new and used books in it. There would be dusty shelves full of dusty books, and there would be stacks of books. There might be classical music playing in the background. There might be one or two cats hanging out around the place, sleeping in the window. McCosh, as I recall, was not a character. He had a bushy beard, as I recall, and it was almost like out of a movie to walk into McCosh's bookshop. Okay.
He was described by someone as a curmudgeon. Do you buy into that from your memories?
Yeah. It's not that he was friendly. Maybe he almost resented you buying some of his books and getting him out of there.
Did you ever see Bob Dylan?
I may have, and I do have a Dylan story. I do recall seeing someone asked to leave the Scholar because he was unpleasant and difficult to deal with and not a very good musician. And I was told that the guy's name was Bob Dylan. Whether it really was or not, whether that's a real memory or not, I don't know. But that's my memory of Bob Dylan at the Scholar. But I do have another Dylan story that's real. Across the street from the Scholar was a wonderful store called the Podium. They sold pipes, and tobacco, and sheet music, and all sorts of instruments. And they had music lessons in the back. And 12 or 15 years later, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who said, I'm going to be playing on a session with Dylan here in town. He's re-recording an album called Blood on the Tracks. And he's going to be using Twin Cities musicians. But Dylan wants a particular type of guitar, and he told me what it was. He said, do you know how we could get our hands on a guitar like that for those sessions? And I referred him to the guy at the Podium who had one. And he was invited to sit in on the recording of Blood on the Tracks so that he could keep his eye on his guitar and get it back when it was over. So anyway, that's my Bob Dylan story linked to Dinkytown, which is that I helped make Blood on the Tracks possible, right?
Let's talk about the beat culture. There was kind of certainly not kind of, there was a beatnik element to the people in Dinkytown. How do you recall that aspect of the culture?
Of course, that was important because Howl by Allen Ginsberg was talked about a lot. It was a very important piece of poetry. The Twin Cities was a crossroads for people going between the coasts. They'd stop off. There was a lot of political. There were a lot of political people who'd stop by. There was a lot of ferment. Various speakers, various writers, either associated with the university or stopping by. I think I remember one summer we probably wore berets because it was totally cool. We were 18 years old. There was definitely a literary undercurrent to what was going on. And the Beats were a big part of it, with the Jack Kerouacs on the road, and that kind of attitude permeated a lot of the attitudes of people who hung out there.
You mentioned politics. Did Dinkytown shape your politics at that young age at all?
I don't know that it shaped my politics, but there was a lot of it. There were loud discussions about communism and socialism and civil rights and human rights and socialized medicine and a lot of very radical politics for the time. It was very, very normal to hear people in loud arguments over small details of politics, radical politics especially. Because where else do you go to talk about that sort of thing except coffee houses and a university area? Certainly not Southdale.
Let's pause for a second.
Called the minor key.
Okay.
Rolling again.
Okay. In addition to the Scholar, there was for a while in the early 60s a little coffee house called the Minor Key. Upstairs they served sandwiches and coffee and fruit drinks. Downstairs, the basement, they had a performance area. John Kerner would play there. on weekends. Bobby Lyle, who was became a well-known musician, got his first job there when he was 16. I know these things because some friends of mine owned the minor key. And one of the people that they hired to work on weekends was a stand-up comedian, a guy who did social satire. And his name was, you're going to have to edit this part out while I get his name right here. Okay. And his name was Hugh Romney. Later he became known as Wavy Gravy, the official clown of the Grateful Dead, and a run-in mate of Jack Kerouac's in Los Angeles in the early 60s. So that kind of thing was not unusual to run into people like that who were doing social satire, comedy, a political commentary of all sorts. That was not at all unusual. That was part of the attraction, I think. There was a lot of ferment going on. I've thought about even the art from that era was abstract art. So there were a lot of cross currents going on in the country at that time. Political, artistic, literary, a lot of ways.
You mentioned John Kerner. Give me some of your thoughts on his music,
Well,
or him as a person, for that matter.
Okay, honestly, I knew Tony Glover much more than I did John. Of course, I used to see Kerner, Ray, and Glover together. All three of them are like a force of nature. Kerner had his own inner metronome going, his own energy, and always had his own thing. Even if you listen to the Kerner Ray albums, you'll notice how frequently he will have one song for him, one song for Dave, and then maybe one song where they're all three working together. Very strong influence on music in the Twin Cities, and in the country, throughout the country. I remember reading an interview with John Lennon talking about when he moved into his place at the Dakota to start setting up the apartment. To get in the mood, he put on the first Kerner Ray Glover album, which was one of his favorites. I think that album still sells internationally. It's a very influential album.
Did you ever encounter students from Marshall University High School?
I did.
Okay.
I don't remember any of them, but I did, and they were part of the whole scene too.
So what was that like? They were going to school in the heart of Dinkytown. You're coming from Edina, bourgeois suburbia. Was it fun hanging with them? And
I think they probably had a pretty good time. They were right on the edge of the action. They were across the street from Dinkytown. I'm not sure that we did much in the way of interaction.
I want to use a sentence that you used during our a phone call, and hopefully you can incorporate that into your answer and what you meant by it. I think you called Dinkytown, quote, the front door to an international university.
Well, it was. I was raised and lived in pretty much an all-white community, very bland, apolitical, and it's like in the movie Wizard of Oz. The first several minutes are shot in black and white, and then the house lands and squishes the witch, and she opens the door, and the world is in Technicolor. That was the difference between the suburban existence and Dinkytown. Dinkytown was real. It had smells and tastes and unusual looking people and people who talked differently, and it was alive.
Let's talk about the diversity, the racial diversity. You mentioned that it was much more. Let me just let you comment on it instead of putting words into your mouth. How, coming from the suburbs again,
sure,
it had to be a bit of an eye-opener, I would think.
Well, it was. And remember, this was like the front door to the university. So at any given time, you'd see professors or students from all over the world walking around the streets and talking with each other, and they may be speaking different languages. They may be wearing more or less clothing from their area of the world, men with turbans, women wearing saris. This was unusual in the late 50s. In Minnesota it was. Might not have been unusual in New York or Los Angeles or London, but in Minnesota it was. And you'd see people with different skin colors, different body shapes, different noses and hair styles and colors. And it was different from the homogeneous suburbs.
How do you think Dinkytown affected your love of music, and maybe how was that applied in your career in radio?
It let me know I was right. In my head, I always knew that there was a greater world out there. So when you walk into a club or a bookstore and you hear jazz, or you go to a place like the basement of Vecchio's on a weekend and you hear some very interesting jazz-oriented music with bongo drums and a flute. This was not what was being heard on popular radio, top 40 radio. So intuitively, I knew that this was right. And that was kind of a nice affirmation.
What am I forgetting to ask about that you want to add?
I think that an important part of Dinkytown, what it did for me at least, was it was a crossroads for ideas, politics, art, cultures. And for a white kid from the all-white suburbs, it was a chance to not only see the world through a different window, but to climb through that window and start to participate in that broader world.
I have a question. When you moved into album rock and you were able to do your controversial shows and you brought in Native Americans, did some of that come out of Dinkytown? And talk about your doing that at KQ.
At KQ, during the early 70s, we knew that we had to really reach out and serve our audience, and we knew that our audience was a little bit different than the typical radio audience. So we stressed that all of our public service announcements and all of our programming, public service programming, would be as inclusive as possible. When we did public service announcements, we promoted the collectives, we promoted communes, vegetarian restaurants, venereal disease clinics, many little theaters that were around, even various street protests that were happening. We really tried to serve our population. Because of that, we thought, well, let's take it a step further. So we had Bill Tilton host a program called KQ Scope, which was a telephone talk show. He took calls from people, and he had guests who were nationally known speakers, and we also had the American Indian Movement Hour, or the American Indian Hour, whatever. I'm not sure what it was called. I think that Clyde Bellecourt was the host of the show. We made that program available to him, and it was the only shot that AIM and those people had to reach out and get their message in front of a larger audience. Nobody else in town was going to give them any airtime. So we did that, and I think that was important. And that all kind of goes back to the openness and the ferment that was engendered in a way in Dinkytown back in those early days, where you started to see that there's a bigger world and more than one way of looking at things.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Bill Tilton you mentioned. Is that the attorney?
Yes.
Okay. So it's interesting that you mentioned him and Clyde Bellecourt, because they both have some connection to Dinkytown. Bill, largely during the war protest, and Clyde had the Heart of the Earth School.
Yes.
And I think the American Indian Movement might have had an office for a short period of time in Dinkytown. So there's that common thread, and it's interesting how X number of years later it would manifest itself again on KQ.
Yeah, in a town like the Twin Cities, there are layers and layers of interaction between people over the years. It's not that it's a closed society, but if you're active in the arts, you're going to run into the same people again and again.
Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, you know, KQRS, basically, Dinkytown was the origin of counterculture, at least in the Twin Cities.
Yeah.
And KQRS seemed to spread that counterculture. How did that work? I mean, how it just disseminated over a period of 4 or 5 years, it just exploded.
Well, it didn't happen by accident. John Pete and myself were living above the Free Store on the West Bank in the early 70s, so we pretty much had our ears to what was going on the street. We practically lived in the street. Our roommates were members of the New Riverside Cafe Collective, and that was an extension of the Dinkytown era. A lot of those people came over to the West Bank from Dinkytown. And so that was like a movable culture, moving from that side of the Mississippi to the West Bank. I was probably more plugged into needs of the people, if I can say that without it being taken the wrong way. I knew about people who had a lot of problems, lived on the street, people who had drug problems, and there were a lot of issues in our society. And at one point, I think we were just saying, if we don't deal with these things, who will? And we did it straightforwardly. We were honest in our presentation. And I think that resonated with our audience. What we were doing was real. It wasn't to get ratings. We really were trying to serve our audience.
Were there drugs, a lot of drugs in Dinkytown when you were hanging out there?
There may have been, but I didn't participate in them. Only I was never asked. I was never invited. I'm sure I probably would have been interested in exploring them. The drugs came later.
I'm going to pause.
Talking about the West Bank and the transition from the Dinkytown area to the West Bank, times were changing. Rents were increasing. I think that there was a lot more real estate available on the West Bank for students. People like Bill Teska moved over to the West Bank and was a founder or an enabler of the New Riverside Cafe and some of the other collectives in town. So there just was a shifting of people. Instead of hanging out at the Scholar, which had been replaced, I guess, by the McDonald's, people were getting older. They were starting to hang out at the Mixers up on Seven Corners. It was just like the whole scene shifted. And then there were a lot of people who wanted to live over on the West Bank. It was really affordable, and you were with your own folks, kind of.
Yeah, tell us about Maury Bernstein.
Okay, well, I mentioned Reverend Bill Teska, who moved over. Red Nelson shifted over there along with his friends, and some of the musicians did too. I remember Maury Bernstein. Maury was a wonderful radio guy. He used to do radio shows that were really cool. He played accordion. He was a multilinguist and teller of great stories, and he loved Scandinavian music. He loved all kinds of music. Just had to mention Maury as being one of those really interesting characters that you couldn't live on the West Bank and not know Maury. He was the kind of guy that if he saw you on the other side of the street when he was walking down the other side, he'd cross over the street and start talking to you. And he would keep talking as long as you let him until you had to go someplace else. But that was Maury. He was a great guy.